Las Vegas, July 1973. Behind the curtain at the Hilton, heat, cigarette smoke, guards holding back reporters, the low hum of a machine that never sleeps. Muhammad Ali is there, but not as a conqueror. He's coming off the most punishing stretch of his life. Stripped of his title, questioned by everyone. Too loud, they say. Too much. A man who turned himself into a caricature. And then someone steps out of the shadows. Not a fan, not a journalist. A man who knows exactly what it costs to be seen by the whole world. Elvis Presley. No cameras, no audience, just a narrow hallway and a moment that won't make headlines. Elvis leans in, his voice barely cutting through the noise, and says something that doesn't sound clever, just true. The loudest man in the room is always the loneliest. Ali laughs it off. He always does. But years later, standing alone after the greatest victory of his career, he will understand why those words mattered more than any punch ever thrown. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Fame did not arrive in their lives as a celebration. It came like pressure. Slow at first, then constant, then impossible to escape. In the late 60s, Muhammad Ali was no longer the man the crowd remembered. The title was gone, stripped not by fists, but by paperwork, courtrooms, and a sentence spoken in an unemotional voice. His refusal to serve in Vietnam turned him from champion into problem. The noise that once followed him everywhere, chants, cameras, arguments, fell away almost overnight. What remained was silence, and it was heavier than any punch he had ever taken. Money thinned, invitations stopped, friends became cautious. Ali, who had built himself into the loudest figure in sports, now woke up in rooms where no one needed him to perform. Publicly, he still spoke in rhythm when microphones appeared. Privately, the words came slower. He began to wonder whether the man he created to survive the world had started to replace the man underneath. The bravado no longer felt like armor. It felt like obligation. Some nights, alone, he asked himself a question that scared him more than exile. If the noise disappeared completely, would anyone still see him? Across the country, Elvis Presley stood under lights brighter than ever before. By the early 70s, Las Vegas adored him. Every show sold out. Every entrance earned thunder. His body still moved the way people expected. His voice still carried power. But the cost was no longer hidden. Backstage, time moved differently. Doctors spoke quietly. Schedules were decided without him. Pills were placed within reach before he asked. The stage, once a refuge, had become a place where everything private was exposed. Elvis felt it most when the music stopped. Applause no longer filled the gap. It vanished too fast. Alone in his suite, he understood something that frightened him. The crowd loved the image more than the man sustaining it. And he had helped build that image brick by brick. Now it owned him. Neither man called himself trapped. They were too proud for that. But both sensed the same truth circling closer. Fame does not loosen its grip when you grow tired of it. It tightens. Ali, cut off from the ring, learned what it meant to exist without permission to be himself. Elvis, surrounded by people, learned what it meant to be alone while constantly watched. Different paths, same cost. They had never met. They did not speak. Yet somewhere between the silence of a band fighter and the roar surrounding a weary singer, the same realization formed. They were standing before the same mirror, each seeing a version of himself that the world had purchased, polished, and refused to release. Las Vegas in July did not pretend to be subtle. Heat pressed against the glass of the Hilton like a held breath, neon bleeding into the desert night, promising escape while delivering repetition. Muhammad Ali arrived without ceremony. No entourage demanding attention, no rehearsed entrance. He was not there to be impressed. To him, it was another showroom, another crowd trained to applaud on cue. He took his seat with the detachment of a man who had already seen too much. The audience around him buzzed with anticipation, tourists leaning forward as if proximity could buy meaning. Ali crossed his arms. He had spent years being spectacle. Tonight, he was immune to it. Behind the curtain, Elvis Presley knew exactly where Ali was sitting. Someone had mentioned it casually, as if it were trivia. But the knowledge settled heavily. Elvis had followed Ali's fights with quiet focus, not for entertainment, but recognition. The defiance, the cost, the way the world demanded performance even while punishing the man beneath it. Knowing Ali was in the room altered the night. Elvis adjusted nothing visible. Same songs, same steps, but backstage he delayed his exit by seconds that mattered only to him. The show moved like a machine that had learned its routine too well. Lights flared, music swelled, applause rose predictably. Ali watched closely, not searching for magic, but for strain. He saw it between notes, in the careful pacing, in the way Elvis conserved movement without anyone noticing. This was not a man floating on admiration. This was a man managing it. When the curtain finally fell, the moment came without announcement. A corridor, a pause, the brief confusion of bodies moving past one another. Then, stillness. They did not smile. They did not reach out. For a second, neither spoke. The space between them held years of projection, myth stacked upon myth. Ali met Elvis's eyes and saw not confidence, but awareness. Elvis looked back and recognized exhaustion he understood too well. No introductions were needed, no praise exchanged, just a quiet acknowledgement that could not be rehearsed. "You survived this," the look said. "So do I." An assistant cleared his throat somewhere behind them. The world resumed motion. But the air had already shifted. Ali walked away unsettled, unable to dismiss the encounter as coincidence. Elvis stood where he was, longer than necessary, aware that something had begun. Not dramatically, not loudly, but inevitably. The robe appeared almost casually, as if it were an afterthought rather than a gesture weighed down by intent. Elvis returned, holding it folded over his arm, the fabric heavier than it looked. White satin caught the light, stitched with symbols that meant more than decoration. Across the back, bold letters declared, "People's Champ." Near the collar, the familiar lightning bolt of TCB rested like a private signature. Elvis offered it without ceremony, a small tilt of the head, no speech prepared. Ali laughed first, not loudly, more out of reflex than amusement. He ran his fingers along the stitching, eyes narrowing with curiosity and disbelief. A fighter's robe from a singer, a nickname he had worn, lost, and fought to reclaim. It felt theatrical, almost playful, like Vegas itself. "You trying to get me in the music business?" Ali joked, the old rhythm slipping out easily. Elvis smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Before anyone could add a comment, Elvis raised a hand toward the security nearby. A simple gesture. They stepped back without question. The corridor emptied until only their breathing remained, the hum of the building pressing in. Elvis leaned closer, lowering his voice, not for drama, but because the words did not belong to the room. "They don't mean to," he said quietly, "but they'll turn you into something you can't get back from." Ali's smile lingered, then stalled. Elvis didn't lecture. He didn't frame it as wisdom. His voice carried no authority, only fatigue sharpened by clarity. He spoke about the mask, how useful it is at first, how protective, and how one day you wake up and realize you don't know where it ends and you begin. About applause that keeps demanding more until there's nothing left to give except the version they already bought. "Don't let them sell all of you," Elvis finished. "Save something you don't explain." The silence afterward stretched, uncomfortable and exposed. Ali shifted his weight, searching for a reply that would restore balance. Humor hovered on his tongue, but it wouldn't land. Instead, he nodded once, slow and thoughtful. He folded the robe carefully, not like a prop, but like something fragile. When they stepped back into the noise, Ali was quieter than when he entered. The laughter returned later, but not immediately. The words had lodged too deep for that. Months from now, Ali would enter a ring expecting cheers, bravado demanded by tradition. The world would wait for noise. What it wouldn't know was that something had already changed in a hallway where no camera stood. And only one. Man understood why. Training camps were usually loud places for Muhammad Ali, not just with sound, but with performance. Reporters circled like flies. Sparring partners repeated his lines before he did. Insults, poems, predictions. These were as expected as footwork. But early in 1974, something unsettled the routine. Ali arrived, did the work, and left. No speeches, no theatrical confrontations staged for cameras. When journalists asked questions, he answered briefly, sometimes not at all. At first, they assumed strategy. Then they sensed unease. The silence didn't feel calculated. It felt unfamiliar even to him. Between rounds, sitting on a stool with sweat darkening the canvas beneath his feet, Ali noticed how people leaned in closer when he said nothing. Trainers waited. Reporters stopped interrupting. The absence of his voice created space, and that space carried weight. It disturbed him. He had always controlled rooms with sound. Now the room seemed to watch him think. At night, alone, fragments of that hallway in Las Vegas returned. Not the words exactly, more the tone, the tired honesty behind them. Ali couldn't admit it openly, but he felt something loosening. When he wasn't performing himself, he could feel his body better, his breathing, his timing, the rhythm underneath the persona. Fight night approached. Expectations hardened. This was supposed to be the return of the old Ali, the verbal dismantling, the playful cruelty, the spectacle. Instead, he walked toward the ring with a reserved expression that unsettled commentators. They filled the gap with speculation, unable to name what they were seeing. The bell rang. Ali moved with restraint. He didn't chase applause. He didn't posture after clean shots. He measured distance, listened to his opponent's breath, conserved energy. The crowd reacted unevenly, confused by the lack of provocation. This Ali wasn't trying to dominate attention. He was managing risk. Between exchanges, his face remained focused, almost distant. He wasn't enjoying himself, not in the old way. And yet, there was control. A quiet danger. Analysts struggled to explain it. They spoke of age, adjustment, tactics. None of them touched the truth. Ali didn't understand it fully either. He only knew that when he resisted becoming what was expected, something sharper emerged. Not louder, not prettier, more precise. The fight ended without revelation, but with a shift, a crack in the image that no one else could yet see. Ali left the ring knowing this wasn't a transformation, just the first moment he hadn't hidden behind the noise. And once heard, that silence would not let him go. The news didn't arrive all at once. It never did with Elvis. It came in fragments, carried by other people's voices. A canceled appearance mentioned in passing. A postponed show explained away as exhaustion. Someone muttering about doctors, about rest, about schedules being adjusted. Muhammad Ali listened without asking questions, but the information stayed with him longer than it should have. In the past, other people's struggles rarely slowed him down. His life had always demanded his full attention. But now, each small update pulled him back to that corridor in Las Vegas, the lowered voice, the pause before the warning. Ali began to understand that the words he'd heard weren't meant to land cleanly. They were thrown like a rope, not knowing if anyone would grab it. One afternoon, alone in a quiet room far from cameras, Ali unfolded the robe. The fabric had softened with time. It no longer felt like a joke or a clever gesture. The stitching looked deliberate now, almost careful. People's champ. The phrase used to ignite something in him, defiance, pride, ownership. Now it carried a different weight, not a title, but a responsibility and a risk. Ali sat with it longer than he intended. He realized something that unsettled him more than the rumors themselves. Elvis hadn't been offering advice. He had been confessing, speaking from inside a place Ali had narrowly avoided or was still approaching. The thought came uninvited and refused to leave. He warned me because he couldn't warn himself. Ali had built his survival on resistance against institutions, expectations, opponents. Elvis, it seemed, had been surrounded by compliance disguised as care. The difference haunted him. Fame hadn't broken either of them, but it had bent them in opposite directions. Ali folded the robe again, slower this time. It was no longer a souvenir. It was a reminder of a line that could be crossed without noticing, of how easily a man could become what others needed him to be, until there was nothing left untouched. For the first time in years, Ali felt a quiet obligation to someone else's truth, not his own image. And he understood that whatever came next in his career, it would not be decided by applause alone. Somewhere far away, Elvis was disappearing from view, and Ali knew with a clarity that left no comfort and that absence could speak louder than any crowd. By the time the plane descended toward Africa, the doubts were no longer whispered. They were spoken plainly, almost kindly. Muhammad Ali was 32, carrying mileage no training camp could erase. Across from him waited George Foreman, stronger, younger, untouched by hesitation. Most experts didn't argue about the outcome. They argued about how long it would take. Ali listened without interrupting. For the first time in his career, he didn't push back. In the days before the fight, Kinshasa felt alive in a way that stripped pretense. Heat pressed down without apology. Crowds gathered not for slogans, but for proximity. Ali walked among them quietly, absorbing energy without feeding on it. Those expecting bravado were unsettled. He no longer needed to announce himself. He was deciding something internally, and no one else was invited into that process. What he chose was not a trick. It wasn't genius revealed in advance. It was a refusal. Ali understood that to fight Foreman head-on would require him to become exactly what the world wanted: defiant, dominant, theatrical. The same version that sold tickets and satisfied expectations. Instead, he considered the cost of being that man again. He thought of the robe folded thousands of miles away, of a voice lowered in a Vegas hallway, not asking for applause, only honesty. Rope-a-dope was born not from confidence, but from acceptance. Acceptance that pain would come, that looking vulnerable might be unavoidable, that letting the world believe he was fading could be the only way to remain himself. In the locker room before the walkout, the noise outside vibrated through the walls. Ali sat alone, hands resting on his knees, breath steady. No mirror talk, no speeches. He wasn't thinking about Foreman's fists or the belt waiting ringside. He was thinking about restraint, about choosing what not to give. "They don't get all of me," he told himself quietly. When he finally stood, there was no rush, no performance, just a man stepping forward with a plan that could fail spectacularly. The risk wasn't physical alone. It was existential. As he moved toward the ring, Ali allowed himself one last thought, not of victory, but of survival. Somewhere, someone had warned him what happens when you give the crowd everything. The bell was moments away, and in that narrow space before history moved, Ali chose silence over certainty, knowing the world was about to mistake it for weakness. The night air in Kinshasa carried weight. Heat clung to skin, refusing relief, pressing breath inward. The crowd surged and swayed, thousands of voices colliding into a single sound that felt less like cheering and more like insistence. This was not Las Vegas. This was not spectacle polished for comfort. This was raw expectation, and it demanded resolution. When the bell rang, Muhammad Ali did not move forward. That alone unsettled everything. George Foreman advanced with certainty, fists heavy, purpose obvious. Each step promised force. Ali retreated not in panic, but with intention, his back meeting the ropes sooner than anyone anticipated. Gasps rippled through the stands. Commentators leaned closer to their microphones, confusion slipping into their voices. This wasn't how legends behaved. Foreman swung. Ali absorbed it. The impact echoed. Flesh met power. The ropes flexed and returned him upright. Another punch followed, then another. Ali's arms rose, elbows tucked, chin guarded. He wasn't countering. He wasn't escaping. He was enduring. From the outside, it looked like surrender. But inside the storm, Ali was listening. To timing, to fatigue, to the subtle shift in his opponent's breathing. Each blow carried information. Each second revealed something Foreman could not hide. Ali spoke softly between exchanges, words meant only for the man in front of him. Not insults, observations, reminders that strength spends itself quickly. The crowd didn't know what to do with this version of Ali. There were no dances, no declarations, just patience bordering on defiance. He allowed himself to look smaller, slower, exposed. In doing so, he removed the mask that had once made him untouchable and replaced it with something more dangerous. Between rounds, Ali sat quietly. No speeches, no rallying cries. Sweat traced paths down his face, his eyes steady. He was not thinking about victory. He was thinking about identity, about choosing not to dominate the moment, but to survive it intact. As the rounds passed, Foreman's certainty began to fray. Power met resistance that refused to break. Ali felt it before anyone else, the hesitation, the cost of unchecked force. In that ring, under that sky, Ali understood something fully for the first time. Strength did not require volume. Control did not demand display. When the opening finally appeared, it felt inevitable, not dramatic, a consequence, not a surprise. The world would remember the outcome. Ali would remember the silence that made it possible. The belt felt heavier than Ali remembered. It rested against his shoulder as cameras crowded in, flashes slicing the air, voices calling his name from every direction. He answered when required, smiled when prompted, lifted his arm when told. The world labeled the moment immediately. Comeback, miracle, genius. Ali let them have their words. He did not correct them. Inside, the victory settled differently. There was satisfaction, yes, but it didn't rush. It arrived slowly, almost cautiously, like something that had learned not to trust applause. In the quiet moments after the celebrations thinned, Ali felt an unfamiliar restraint. He had won by refusing to be what everyone expected, and that refusal stayed with him longer than the triumph. Life moved forward, interviews blurred together, the story hardened into legend. And somewhere within that momentum, a small unease lingered, an unspoken need to share the outcome with the one person who would understand what it truly cost. That moment never came. In August of 1970, even the news reached him without ceremony. No press conference, no dramatic announcement. Just a quiet conversation, a lowered voice saying a name that didn't need explanation. Elvis Presley was gone. Ali did not respond immediately. He didn't ask how. He didn't ask when. He sat still, absorbing the finality of it. The room felt smaller, as if something essential had been removed without warning. His first emotion surprised him. It wasn't shock. It wasn't even grief. It was guilt. He thought of that hallway in Las Vegas, of the robe placed in his hands, of a man who spoke softly not because he was weak, but because he was already tired. Elif understood now that the warning hadn't been abstract. It had been personal, urgent, too late. Elvis had seen the end approaching and chosen to speak anyway. Ali realized that the silence he had learned to use as protection was something Elvis had never been allowed. The world never stopped asking him to give more, and eventually there was nothing left that belonged only to him. That night, Ali stood alone for a long time. He didn't play music. He didn't talk. He simply allowed the truth to settle. One man had listened in time. The other had not been given that chance. The victory, the belt, the noise of history, all of it dimmed in comparison. Elvis had saved him without ever knowing how far the echo would reach, and that knowledge would never leave him. Time changed Muhammad Ali in ways no opponent ever could. The voice that once filled rooms began to soften. Words arrived slower, measured, often left unsaid. People noticed the quiet first. Some mistook it for absence, others for decline. Ali never corrected them. He had learned that explanation was optional. In private moments, he no longer reached for the spotlight that once felt essential. He chose smaller rooms, fewer listeners. When he spoke there, it wasn't to perform. It was to place something carefully between sentences and trust that it would land. Once, years after the cheers had thinned, someone asked him about Elvis, not in public, not for a quote, just a question spoken gently, without expectation. Ali paused longer than usual. He didn't recount the night in Las Vegas, didn't mention the show, the crowd, the timing. He spoke instead about warning signs, how they rarely come from people who feel safe, how the most honest words are often whispered because they aren't meant to impress. He wasn't telling me how to live, Ali said quietly. He was telling me what happens if you don't stop. There was no bitterness in his voice, only clarity. Ali kept the robe, not displayed, not framed, folded carefully, stored away like something that didn't belong to the past, but didn't need to be seen. It wasn't a trophy, it was a boundary. Proof that at one moment, just one, he had listened instead of performing. He understood then what real strength had been all along, not volume, not domination, the courage to remain human when the world prefers a symbol. Ali had been the loudest man alive, and yet what saved him was a pause, a decision not to give everything away, a truth delivered by someone who had already paid the price. Their story was never about friendship. It wasn't about music or boxing. It was about recognition. Two men meeting briefly at the edge of themselves. One spoke in time, one listened. And that single act changed the shape of a life.